Hello everybody and welcome back to TowerGate. This is a special edition of TowerGate. In this particular edition I'm going to talk about the NeoCons. I had a request from someone in my comments section that wanted me to talk about this topic. Now this is a topic that I could go on for hours and hours on. Unfortunately I'm going to try to keep the video to 30 minutes and that means I can't do a whole lot of ranting and raving. I just have to try to stick to the facts. So I have taken my notes. I will try to stay on my notes as much as possible and not deviate into other areas, and hopefully keep this video down to 30 minutes and still get to all the important information that we need to know to really understand the NeoCons and their agenda, where they came from, and the whole 9 yards. Now, I will still do my typical Saturday evening video, which I expect I'll have uploaded by 9 p.m. on Saturday evening, Eastern Time. And still covering all the major issues that are happening, because there's a lot of breaking issues to be talked about in that video. So I didn't want to waste a whole one of my regular videos on a segment on the NeoCons. I just wanted to do this as a separate segment. So here we go, the NeoCons. First of all, to understand the NeoCons, we have to understand where they came from and who was the father of the what we would consider to be, at that time, modern neoconservatism. Although the modern neoconservatism has modified itself over time, and so as I go through this, you'll see how it has modified itself. But the original father of the philosophy of neoconservatism was a man named Leo Strauss. Now, Leo Strauss was a refugee from Nazi Germany, who taught at the New School for Social Research in New York and at the University of Chicago between the years 1939 and 1958. Strauss formulated his philosophy by subscribing to the ideas of Jewish intellectuals who were in New York City in the 1930s. These Jewish intellectuals were strongly opposed to Stalinism, but were on the hard political left. Some were even Trotskyites. The great majority of these early neocons became liberal Democrats, joining the Democratic Party. Now, the early neoconservative agenda has probably changed, as far as if you look at their website or you talk to a major neoconservative, like a Bill Kristol or someone like that, you'll find that there are 3 major themes, or their top themes for selling their neoconservatism hasn't been modified over the years. But the most common understanding of the 3 major themes for the neoconservative movement are the following. Number 1, a belief deriving from religious conviction that the human condition is defined as a choice between good and evil, and that the true measure of political character is to be found in the willingness by the former to confront the latter. Okay, so what they're basically saying in their first statement of their major theme here is that they believe the world is divided into black and white, good and evil. We are good. Everyone else, or anyone we point to and say, them guys, the boogeymen, they are evil, and therefore we must defeat that evil. It is a religious obligation. It is a moral obligation. It's an obligation as a citizen of this country that you should be 100% for fighting any of your enemies and destroying them. That is number 1 of the major themes of neoconservatism. Number 2, that the fundamental determinant of the relationship between states rests on military power and the willingness to use it. Well, this shouldn't surprise us that the neocons' primary driving force behind them is this relationship between the state and their great military power. But not just to have this military power for defense, but to use this military power to actually go out and defeat the enemy, the evil. Now, this is why the neoconservatives are so strongly supported by the defense and the banking industry, because the philosophy that they love to follow is a philosophy that brings tremendous amounts, billions and billions of dollars to the banks who finance the weapons contracts, and to the defense contractors who manufacture them. Number 3, a primary focus on the Middle East and global Islam as the principal theater for American overseas interest. Now, this is more of the modern philosophy of the neoconservatives. Prior to September 11th, 2001, the prior driving force was communism and the Soviet Union. But once the Soviet Union collapsed and communism in most places around the world along with it, they had to find a new boogeyman. And so we got 9/11, the new Pearl Harbor, which we'll be talking about a little bit more. But these are the 3 primary driving themes which motivate the neoconservatives. Let's talk a little bit now about the story of the neoconservatives and how they went from being just this group of Jewish intellectuals in the 1930s to being the most powerful force, unfortunately, driving foreign policy in our country today. The NeoCons started as a bunch of leftists, Jewish intellectuals who were socialist, that opposed the mainstream Democrats and liberals that were backing the USSR and Joseph Stalin. Early neocons found themselves in the Democratic Party or the right wing of the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party was an official party and had a lot of membership up until I think 1973 or 4, I think is when they actually ended the Socialist Party. But there were many of the early neocons that were on a wing of that socialist movement, and the rest would fall into the regular Democratic Party, but would be on the more the right wing or sort of conservative side of the Democratic Party. There used to be a conservative side of the Democratic Party, for those of you who didn't know that. Then along came the 1960s. It was a time of great change. You had the civil rights movements, opposition to the Vietnam War, and the movement for economic equality for women. These 3 major movements of the 60s allowed these certain Democrats to find a home in the Democratic Party. These people, these Democrats that participated and supported in the civil rights movements and all these other movements that were going on, then became known as the New Left. Now, the New Left, which had largely deserted the Democratic Party of Lyndon Johnson, primarily because of the Vietnam War, now came back to the Democratic Party, reinvigorated on the back of these new changes that were happening in the party with the civil rights and all the other issues, the Vietnam War and all that. So all this is going on, and so they essentially reinvigorated the Democratic Party on the social left-wing side. Now this left the neocons, who were kind of on the right of the Democratic Party, kind of out in the cold. And so they opposed, in 1968, they opposed the nomination of George McGovern. These new Democrats, who were part of all these civil rights movements, part of all these things that were going on in the 60s, the anti-war thing, all that, all these people who had been Democrats who deserted the Democratic Party, deserted Lyndon Johnson, parted with them on the Vietnam War, the civil rights and all the other things, voting rights and all these other things, they decided to get back involved, and this kind of pushed the neocons out. So the neocons in 1968 were getting behind Scoop Jackson. Scoop Jackson was a conservative Democrat. A lot of people say he was the last real conservative Democrat that actually had any real power. So in 68, we see that George McGovern, chosen by the Change Democrats, the more liberal social Democrats, this moved the neocons out. They went with Scoop Jackson. Scoop Jackson lost. McGovern won the Democratic primary, and then he was soundly defeated by Richard Nixon in 1968 in the general election with a 48-state landslide by Richard Nixon. This, of course, humiliated these neocons, and they decided to leave the Democratic Party, and they began to infiltrate and move into the Republican Party. This occurred after the failed election in 1968 by Scoop Jackson, the nomination of George McGovern, who was considered to be a dove on defense and not very sensitive to the issues regarding Israel, not considered to be a good friend of Israel, and therefore this pretty much is what drove the neocons out of the Democratic Party into the arms of the Republican Party, which was now in a state of disarray, having just had to have the president resign from the Watergate scandal and all the other things. I'm rambling. So now let's go on. The neoconservatives left the Democratic Party, joined the Republican Party. The Republican Party at that time had a healthy skepticism for foreign interventions. Of course, now all that was going to change. In order to achieve their goal of world domination, the neocons decided to create a great common enemy. And to advance that idea that it was America's obligation and duty to wipe out evil in the world. The great battle of good versus evil would be used to advance their global agenda for a new world order. But they needed an enemy to unite against. Who would that be? The communist, the USSR. And it was quite convenient because, like I say, we had just lost the Vietnam War. And so the dominoes were falling in Laos and Cambodia and various other places around the globe as communism was seen to be spreading. So this played very well into the narrative, and the neocons found some success. But the neocons had one problem. Henry Kissinger, Nixon's Secretary of State. Kissinger wanted to have improved relations with Russia and China, both communist countries. Kissinger wanted to create a system of global dependence and to reduce the risk of world war. Kissinger had his own version of the New World Order. Yes, my friends, it is true. There are different factions of the New World Order. They're not all on the same sheet of music. There are fights amongst them. And back in the 70s, as the neocons were trying to infiltrate the Republican Party and sell their Fear Russia campaign back then, they were running into a problem because it's the opposite of what Kissinger was trying to sell. Kissinger actually had his own phrase, which was a world without fear. And the idea was to build economic interdependencies between us and the Chinese and to work on signing treaties reducing nuclear weapons. These were both things that were 180 degrees in the opposite direction of where these neocons wanted to go. But the neocons' strategy to sell fear didn't jive with Kissinger. So the struggle for control of the party's foreign policy was on. When the smoke cleared, Kissinger would win, but the neocons would not be defeated. They were down, but they weren't out. Because next up would become a golden opportunity for them. They would seize that opportunity very quickly. First, of course, the loss of the Vietnam War, then the resignation of President Nixon after the Watergate affair. Once that happened, and after Nixon resigned, Ford was then sworn in. And he brought into his new administration two prominent neoconservatives, Duck It's Dick Cheney and Dick WMD Rumsfeld, Donald WMD Rumsfeld, I mean. Now Cheney and Rumsfeld would then restart to reignite the war of good and evil, with the USSR being the enemy that we must defeat, and President Ford took the bait. Paul Wolfowitz was chosen to lead the campaign to scare the hell out of Americans by getting them to believe that the Soviet Union was secretly working to destroy America with secret weapons that the neocons claimed that the Soviets possessed, despite no evidence of that. Despite the fact that the Soviet Union was actually in the early stages of collapse. The neocons, of course, found a great friend in Reagan. He also was a fierce opponent of the Soviet Union and the spread of communism. Reagan would allow many neocons to take root in the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, the Department of State, and throughout the bureaucracy. This continued even more throughout the administrations of Bush 1 and 2. In 1998, the NeoCons sent a letter, a document, to President Clinton called the PNAC document, the Project for a New American Century. This document called for a new Pearl Harbor event, a catastrophic event that would be the reason to launch the new NeoCon global plan for world dominance. On September 11th, 2001, the NeoCons got their new Pearl Harbor. And the NeoCons began their series of wars across the globe, Afghanistan, Iraq. They wanted to get that war in Syria going, but Bush got caught up in the mess in Iraq and wasn't able to move forward. And even with things going as badly as they were going in Iraq, the NeoCons were still pushing W to go on into Syria anyway, get that war started, with the eventual goal, Syria being just a stepping stone, as well as Iraq, just a stepping stone, to set up forward military bases for the real target, which was Iran, and still is Iran, and their good friend, the Russians. So, a lot of people ask, why have the NeoCons been so successful, despite the fact that they have had so many failings? I mean, let's take a look at the facts. The NeoCon war in Iraq has now cost us $3 trillion. In the next 10 years, that figure will be around $6 trillion. We've lost over 5,500 servicemen there. We've had over 32,000 wounded. The country of Iraq was destroyed. We created a void which gave birth to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Massive destabilization of the Middle East, massive military and economic failure for the United States, disaster for the Iraqis. The official numbers of how many Iraqis have been killed is 150,000, but many estimate it's closer to 500,000, and that's not even including the 500,000 children we starved to death during the Clinton years when we had Madeleine Not-So-Bright's sanctions on the country of Iraq. Now, there's a couple things also to note about the NeoCons that people wonder, how do they manage to stay in power? How are they so influential when no one likes them? Clearly, Senator Magoo, a fierce NeoCon, ran against Barack Obama and got defeated soundly. Nitwit Romney, a NeoCon, ran. Both of these guys running on hardcore NeoCon foreign policy, both defeated soundly by Barack Obama. We saw Lindsey Graham, the prominent neoconservative, in 2016. He never even cracked 1%, never even made it even into the debates. He had to be on the kiddie stage. So people will ask how the neoconservatives managed to stay so, not so much relevant, but to stay and have so much power. Well, it's because the neoconservatives are kind of like parasites. Whether it's the Republican or the Democratic Party, they realize that their ideas are not popular enough to stand on their own or win them enough votes or enough people to put them in power. So what they have to do is they have to, like parasites, attach themselves to a host. And once they attach themselves to a host, they now have a vehicle for their power. And they derive their power by getting directly connected and finding joint interest with the most powerful forces in the country, because they understand that the political class, the politicians, are just merely puppets, that they are largely, their behavior is largely dictated by outside forces, powerful forces, and those are the forces that the neocons attach themselves to, while acting as a parasite on the body of either the Republican or Democratic Party, whichever one they choose to be in at the time. For instance, the neocons are extremely connected to Wall Street, because there is where the bankers are, who are the ones who create the money for the defense contractors. And then you have the defense contractors, which the neocons are very connected to, because they are the one that create the weapons of war. Then, of course, they're very connected to the Defense Intelligence Agency, the defense establishment. They are very, very connected to the media. So you have the neocons connecting themselves to Wall Street, the defense establishment, and to the media. So that you can always find plenty of neocons given opportunities to go out and preach their fear. This is their agenda. They preach fear. And they manage to have plenty of money because they're funded by defense contractors, by big bankers, because they sell war. And war is big money to bankers and to defense contractors. And the politicians will largely move in the direction they're being pushed into by the defense contractors and the large bankers, because they fund a lot of these political campaigns. If you look, you'll see that whether it was W. Bush, Hillary Rotten Clinton, the Rotten Reverend, whether it was Obama, you'll see that their top 10 contributors are banks and defense contractors. Neocons are evil, but they are not stupid. Unlike the Democratic Party, and a lot of people talk about the deep state coup. Where's that coming from? Believe me, it's not coming from the Democrats. They're far too incompetent. Far too incompetent. The deep state coup is largely being fomented by the neocons, who have infiltrated both political parties because of their connection to the money. Now, let's talk about, for a moment, the traits of a neocon and how you spot a neocon. Here are the traits of a neocon. Number one, you can identify a neocon if they support international organizations and treaties. You will find that neocons all supported all that free trade stuff. They all supported NAFTA, CAFTA, and GATT, the World Trade Organization, all these global organizations. You will find the neocons in complete support. They support all these treaties. They are believers in global government, part of the New World Order. Now, their group vision of the New World Order may be different than those of the socialists in Europe. They may be different than some other groups within this globalist cadre. But they are a very powerful force because they have so much influence in America. And America is, of course, the most powerful force on the global stage. So you can always tell a neocon by their support for international organizations and treaties. The number two trait, they support preemptive war. You'll notice that all neocons, whenever there's any type of a conflict or any type of deals going on in foreign policy, like we see in North Korea or like we see in Syria or anywhere else on the globe, the solution for the neocons is always preemptive war. If you read the white papers from the neocons, you will see one stark difference between them and most other sane people on the planet. They believe in preemptive war because they believe it's possible to win a nuclear war. They believe, they write white papers on the fact that we can defeat the Soviet Union, or in this case Russia. We can defeat Russia in a nuclear war if we strike first. So this is why they believe the preemptive war, the first strike policy, and of course that became the Bush Doctrine. It was the neocons who wrote the Bush Doctrine, which is, hey, we believe now in preemptive war. Turning back 35, 40 years of history of American and Soviet presidents who did everything they could to make sure we did not have a strategy of preemptive war because of the potential danger for a full-scale nuclear conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union at that time and the Russians today. The neocons will always support preemptive war. Next, the neocons will always support big government, and their very favorite big government program are the surveillance programs. They love the surveillance programs. You'll always find the neocons, Senator Magoo, Lindsey Graham, even people like Ted Cruz, who claim to be a constitutionalist, Marco Rubio, people like that. You will find that these neoconservatives will always support what they may campaign on, what they may talk about is one thing. When you look at how they vote, they always vote to give the government more power to surveil citizens any way they can do it. and they'll defend them when they get caught. The next trait is that you'll notice that almost all NeoCons are members of the CFR and other global organizations. These are like foreign policy think tanks. Many of these NeoCons have been head of the Council on Foreign Relations. Dick Cheney was head of the Council on Foreign Relations. The Rotten Reverend Clinton attended many CFR meetings. The CFR basically gets together with other globalists and they work on laying out strategies and plans for advancing their agenda for global world dominance, for the New World Order. The next trait you'll find about the neoconservatives is they are Russia haters. They're anti-communist, which is good, but they're Russia haters. And it's not that they really believe that Putin and Russia are such a threat. It's merely their boogeyman that they can use to advance a much larger global agenda. Remember, the neocons must have a boogeyman. There will never be peace on this planet as long as the neocons have anything to say to those who are in positions of power. Because again, they see the world as black and white, good and evil, and that we must use our military superiority to impose our goodwill on everyone who doesn't think like we do, or anyone who stands in the way of our agenda. And that's why the Russians are public enemy number one to the neocons, because we have a lot of differences. Specifically, the Russians believe in a multipolar world. The neocons, that's something they despise. They believe in a unipolar world, and they believe that we are an omnipotent power, and that if we are ever challenged by anyone, whether it be Russia, China, or anyone else, we must stomp them out of existence. This is the neocon philosophy. This is why you'll notice they're all Putin haters and Russia haters. Finally, one characteristic you'll find about neocons is they are Israel-centric. Now, we all recognize Israel as a friend, as an ally, and as a country who is in a very tough situation in the region where they live. But the thing that separates the neocon from the average American or average person is that for the neocons, they put the interest of Israel ahead of the interest of the United States. Many neocons have dual citizenship. They're both Israeli and American citizens. This is where I part company with the neocons. On another point is that, to me, the United States and Israel have many interests that are joint interests, but we have other interests that are not the same. And if it is an American, if it comes down to the interest of the United States or the interest of Israel, I have to do the thing which acts in the best interest of my country. I'm an American. This is not true for the neocons. Their heart, their physical bodies may be in Washington or New York or Los Angeles, but believe me, their heart is in Tel Aviv. And this will be borne out if you look at their voting record, if you look at their rhetoric, if you look at the things they do and talk about. You'll notice this to be true. These are the traits and how you can identify a neocon. Now, just to prove that point, I'm going to go down through a list of some of the more prominent neocons. And I think you'll see what I'm talking about if you can remember any of the things they've said, observed any of the things they've done, or if you want to look into any of these people. I think you'll find that these people all meet all of the criteria to be neocons. George Herbert Walker Bush, George W. Bush, Duckett's Dick Cheney, Liz Cheney, Joe Lieberman, Max Boot, Paul Bremer, what a disaster he was, Senator Magoo, Lindsey Candy Pants Graham, Marco Meltdown Rubio, Elliot Abrams, William Bennett, the failed drug warrior, Elliot Cohen, Scooter Libby, the rotten Reverend Clinton, Peter, we talked about him the other day, this Dick Peter Wiener, Richard Pearl, the Prince of Darkness, the author of the Pinochle, Paul Wolfowitz, the salesman for war, Don W.N.D. Rumsfeld, James Woolsey, Mr. Clean and Green, Robert Kagan, husband of Victoria Fuck the EU Newland, Arthur Brooks, Fred Barnes, David Frum, Jonah Goldberg, Frederick Kagan, Charles the Krauthammer, Irving Kristol, who's been deceased for many years, father of Billy Crystal of the Weekly Standard, who's leading the charge in the efforts of the deep state to take down Trump. We have Daniel Pipes, Jennifer and Michael Rubin, H.R. McMaster, General John Kelly, and thousands more who are buried into the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, the Wall Street banks, the think tanks, the media, government bureaucracies, and the Congress. These are many of your NeoCons. Now, I will say that those who watch my video probably know I've stated before the NeoCons are far more dangerous than even the white supremacists, the KKK, or any of these groups on the left. It's because none of these other groups have any real support in the country. They don't have enough votes to do anything politically. They don't have enough membership to create any great movement in the country. All that can be is an annoyance to us for the most part. They can cause a lot of problems, but they really will never accomplish anything politically. The NeoCons are the most dangerous force in the country today and in the world because they do have connections to the seats of power, to the levers of power. They have all the connections connected to the media, the Defense Department, the money, the Wall Street bankers. They're connected to all of it, and they are deeply rooted throughout the current administration. Trump inherited these people. You can't even hardly drain these people because they're in the bureaucracy. It will take time, but I'm sure Trump will do the best he can. But you can't get rid of all these people, but they're causing a lot of problems. They are probably the #1 group. While everybody wants to blame the Democrats, keep in mind, I told you, the Democrats are far too incompetent, too stupid. They can't find their ass with both hands. They could never organize a plot such as a deep state coup. It's the NeoCons. That's the people we need to be focusing on, my friends. The NeoCons are the most dangerous force in the country, the biggest threat to world peace, the biggest threat to peace and prosperity, the biggest threat to the Constitution. It will take some time to weed these people out because they generally don't run for political office because they can't get elected. They do their work in other ways, through other techniques. So this is basically the NeoCons. This is who they are, and this is why we need to be so concerned about them. And I talk about Trump being surrounded by them. Trump's not a NeoCon. We know from in his campaign during 2016, he talked a lot about a lot of issues where he's opposed to the NeoCons, and that's why they're fighting him so badly. He's going to have to remain strong and stand his ground. It's going to be a hell of a battle. But Kissinger pretty much defeated him, along with Nixon, when they tried to impose their will on them. I believe Trump can do the same, but it's pretty tough because he doesn't have a Kissinger. If anything, Steve Bannon was his closest thing you could come to a Kissinger, which could keep him apart from the NeoCons. But H.R. McMaster and General Kelly are NeoCons, and they're close advisors to the president. I hope he can stand strong. I hope he still talks to Bannon. I hope he still talks to some of these other people that will defer him, Roger Stone, people like that, who will educate the president, make sure he doesn't get trapped by the NeoCons, or he'll end up in the same boat George Bush was in, or worse. So that's my thoughts on the NeoCons. Thank you so much for tuning in. I expect to have my Saturday evening video uploaded with the day's events by 9 p.m. on Saturday, maybe earlier. Thank you so much for tuning in for my talk on the NeoCons. Y'all have a good night. Bye.